In the last video, we saw how to make multiple buttons using individual objects and functions. In this video, we're going to see how object-oriented programming can improve the process even more. One of the best ways to make code reusable and powerful is to use object-oriented programming, especially for making user interactive controls like buttons. If you don't remember how exactly OOP works, here's the link for review. To use OOP to make buttons, we'll need to define a button object type and then define methods on it, like to draw it and handle mouse clicks. To define that button object type, we need to start with the constructor, the special function that takes in configuration parameters and sets the initial properties of the object instance. So we're going to just define a normal looking function but give it some arguments, width and height, and inside of here we're going to use the this keyword to store a x property in this function, in this constructor of ours, and go ahead and pass in the parameters. There we go. And then underneath here we're going to store this new button object inside a variable called button1. New button, and just give it a couple parameters, 100, 100, 150, and 50. Okay, now that would certainly work, but I have another approach I'd like to recommend. Instead of taking in individual parameters like this, the constructor could take in a configuration object. So we can just give it config for short of configuration, and then take these properties from that config object. So config.y, config.width, config.height. And in here we actually just give it a object in just a moment. The advantage of the config object is that we can keep adding more parameters for the constructor to handle, like a label. Config.label, and that's a lot easier to work with. You don't have to add another argument and then pass in another parameter. It's easy for us to understand what each parameter does when we construct the button. So now we're going to give this constructor an object to work with, and inside we're going to give it an x property at 100, a y property at 102. Then under here, width would be 150, a height at 50, and then let's see, a label would be please click, and I should leave a period for extra properties and indent. But what if most buttons will actually have the same width or height? We shouldn't have to keep specifying the width and height parameters for every button. We should only have to specify them when necessary. We can have the constructor check if the property is actually defined in the config object and set a default value if not. So if I don't pass in the x property for this object, it'll just use the default 0. And the same goes for the y. And this width and height can actually be just set to 150 and 50. And the label can just be a simple click string. And now we can actually just remove the width and height to make it a little bit easier on our part. Now that we have the constructor set up, let's define a bit of behavior, like a draw method. It'll be the same code as the draw button function here, but it will grab all the properties from this since it's defined on the object prototype itself. So we don't have to pass in any objects into a function anymore. So down here, button.prototype.draw, paste it in. Replace this button with this. And there we go. And ONOS is telling me that draw button isn't defined. That's because I deleted it, and we're not going to be needing that anymore. So back up to here. Good. So now what we can do is call this draw function underneath the draw button, or the button 1, button 1.draw. So now it will draw buttons whenever we want to make a new one. And restarting, of course, shows that it works now. Now it's time to handle the clicking. We can start by defining a function on the button prototype that will report true if the user clicked inside a particular button's bounding box. So prototype dot is mouse inside equals function, and I'll just steal the code from this old function of ours and delete it. We won't be needing that, and I'll go ahead and remove this if condition, which we will edit in a moment, and replace button with this again. And what I'm doing here is double clicking the button so that it highlights that word, and I just replace it with this. It's kind of nice and simple. Now that we have that, from inside this new function, we can set a new condition in the mouse clicked. So if button 1 dot is mouse inside, we will just print still pretty useless. There we go. Works like we would want. But there's something that bothers me about the way we've set up that click handling. The whole point of object-oriented programming is to bundle up all the behavior related to an object inside the object, and to use properties to customize behavior. But we've left some of the behavior dangling outside the object, and those would be the printlns inside this mouse clicked. Oops. So what we're going to do is give the constructor here a new property, and it's going to be a function actually. On click, oops, not like that. On click equals config dot on click, and in case we don't pass in a function, we'll just give it a no op function or an empty function that has no operation. And underneath here, I'll create a new method. It's going to handle the mouse clicks. Handle mouse click equals function. And in here, we're going to check if this dot is mouse inside. So we're really just checking if part of our object type, one of its methods, will return true. And let's see, oh yes, we forgot the extra bracket there. And then inside here, we're going to call this new onClick function. And now what we do next is add a actual onClick function to this new object down here. So what would it be? Instead of a println like we've been using, I'll actually just draw some text, and inside give it a text command, oops, that says you clicked me. Set it at 100, 300. There we go. And go down to the mouse clicked function, replace this with button 1 handle mouse click. Okay, that's much nicer. Now let's check and see if it works. Let's look back at our code. We have an onClick function. It returns a text. We draw our button, of course. Now, up here, if is mouse inside, I'm just checking my spelling mostly. Oh, look at that. I use a uppercase O there. I need to use the camel case uppercase C. Now it should work. Yes, it does. And even pretty advanced coders can make simple mistakes like that, so always make sure to check your spelling if you don't get the result you want. And now we're done. We have a button object that can easily create new buttons out of it, making each button look different and responding differently to click events. Now that you have this as a template, you should customize your buttons in other ways, like different colors, or have them respond to other events like mouse over. Try it out in your programs.